You know, you're not real.
I know that you are not real.
Did I ever tell you the story about the American space pen?
I've heard so many of your stupid American stories, but go ahead, amuse me with another one. I have time.
I like your shirt.
And I like yours too.
You sound like a girl.
You are balding.
Yeah, hi, it's Mark again. Today we'll explore a little more about Russian logic versus American logic. We'll do this from space today. And of course, this isn't really space, but I thought my background was fitting for this particular episode. Anyhow, I'm just having some fun. Okay, right from the beginning, I want to say that this episode did not at all go in the direction I expected. I already knew what I would discuss because I knew the story so well, having lived through it. Well, you need to watch this entire episode because the end is a real surprise. I mean, it was a huge surprise to me even, and I'm old enough to where it's not that easy to surprise me. Anyhow, when Yuri Gagarin launched into space as the first Earthling to do so, the space race between the US and the Soviet Union really heated up. I know, because I lived through these times and I loved it. This was Cold War competition, but it didn't involve armies or nuclear weapons. It was exciting for the entire world. It was certainly exciting for me, a young boy growing up in the 1960s. Well, after my last video, I decided to create this video concerning pen versus pencil in space. Now, I don't know about Russians, but most all Americans who grew up during the space race remember many stories, but this one in particular, not because it was so dramatic, but because it so brightly shone a light on how Russians think versus Americans. How we both sometimes approach a problem from two very different directions. And this was the pen versus pencil story. The problem was writing in space, zero gravity. American astronauts first brought regular ballpoint pens with them to write with. They had to be extensively modified so that the astronauts could write with them while wearing their bulky gloves. The modifications, though, only affected the form and shape of the outside of the pen. What was quickly learned by the astronauts was that regular ink pens don't work well in zero gravity. So, as a typical bureaucratic agency, NASA then spent almost a year and more than $1 million, which would be roughly equal to about $12 million today, researching and developing a space pen. The space pen worked very well and solved the problem that the astronauts were experiencing with standard ballpoint pens in zero gravity. With enough money, research, and technology, we can solve any problem, seemed to be the American mantra. Now, the other side, the Soviet Union, sent their astronauts into space with pencils. Of course, Americans, upon hearing of the large amount of money spent on creating the space pen, wondered why we also didn't bring pencils. It seemed a little embarrassing to see how pragmatic the USSR was in tackling the same problem and how they came up with a simple and cost-effective solution to the problem that we Americans threw $12 million to solve. It just seemed to many in America that our people threw the taxpayer money around in a very haphazard way, coming up with a much more complex solution than what was needed. Lots of money wasted. Of course, a pencil. It was especially disturbing to think that we didn't think of it first. Well, I think that you get the idea. My plan was to do an episode about this as an example of how sometimes it seems that Russians are much more pragmatic than Americans. That as Americans, we tend to overthink and overdo things that have a much simpler solution. So I went on the internet to research the facts surrounding this whole pencil versus pen story and was suddenly pulled into a completely different direction. Turns out that the story I knew and most others knew was nothing more than an urban myth. Maybe everyone else watching this video right now already knows the true story and are amazed at how stupid I am to have believed the myth for so long. But anyhow, now for the real story. The American astronauts up through 1965 were bringing regular ballpoint pens into space, but experienced real problems with these pens being able to function properly in zero gravity. Ink must fall down in the pen due to gravity. Well, anyhow, they also tried using pencils, but pencil tips break and small floating tips can raise havoc with the exposed electronics aboard the ship. You've seen it, all the switches on the walls and everything else. What changed the situation was that a man named Paul Fisher, who was president and owner of the Fisher Pen Company, decided on his own to come up with a solution. Paul did invest more than $1 million of his own money in order to solve this problem. In 1965, he invented and patented the Fisher Space Pen. This pen could write in zero gravity, any position, even upside down. It could write underwater also. So yeah, NASA did not invent or even fund the space pen. Rather, it was Paul Fisher of the Fisher Pen Company who invested about $1 million of his own money into developing this. Well, NASA tested the pen and it exceeded all the requirements that they had. And starting with the Apollo 7 mission, NASA has used the Fisher Space Pen on all manned flights into space. And there are boxes of these space pens even at the International Space Station, and also used in the new Boeing capsule and the Dragon capsules made by Elon Musk. Now, here's a picture of Walt Cunningham, Apollo astronaut from Apollo 7, writing in space with the very first Fisher Space Pen aboard Apollo 7 on its way to orbit the moon. And here's another picture of him 50 years later, still rocking the Fisher Space Pen. I don't know if it's the same one, but it's the same model. The space pen invented for space use is the Fisher AG7 model, AG standing for anti-gravity. Now here's another surprising fact. Remember, this is the great space race. But Paul Fisher offered the Fisher AG7 space pen to the Soviet space program. And the Soviets, which now the Russians of course, have been using these in all their manned flights since 1969. Back then, the Americans and the Soviets were given a price of $2.39 per pen. So you can see where the urban myth is way off base. Now, I just learned all this while prepping to make this video. I actually enjoyed the urban myth a lot more. The urban myth painted NASA as a typical bureaucratic agency doing what these agencies do best, wasting taxpayer money on stupid things. I also enjoyed thinking that the story illustrated the much different logic displayed by the Americans and the Soviets. I like thinking that the Soviets thought in a much more practical manner. Really, I did like that. Now I find out I was wrong, and so are many others wrong about this particular situation. Both the Russians and Americans tried using pencils, and both rejected their use because of the risk of broken pieces of graphite floating around, potentially damaging the electronics. The Russians had settled on using grease pencils on erasable small boards, but this still left the problem of floating paper peels from the grease pencils, which you need to peel the paper to expose the tip. And besides, grease pencils were clumsy and they didn't write that well. I was pleasantly impressed that these new Fisher space pens were offered to both the American and the Soviet space programs, and it certainly made writing in space a much more pleasant experience for the astronauts and cosmonauts of both nations. As I mentioned earlier, I love the space race and what later became space cooperation. Both countries are much better off because of this. And I also feel that perhaps in a small way, it helped the US and the USSR draw a little closer and even develop a little bit of trust, which was rare in those times. One last small example of Russians and Americans having a different mindset, and this is also based in space, so I'll stay here with my background. But that was a difference on how we would approach fixing things. Please watch this short clip showing how a Russian cosmonaut approaches a repair in space.
This is our big problem in the Russian space station because I don't want to stay here anymore. Yeah, finally, we can go home.
Now, I've seen many a Russian get a little pissed at how this scene portrayed Russians as rough, brutish, and uneducated. Personally, I don't know of any American who, when watching this clip, felt that way. As an American guy, I'm impressed by this clip. It's exactly how I would like to approach this situation. And besides, his methods worked, and he saved the day. There is no way not to love this cosmonaut. I mean, not just in this scene, throughout the film. But it is a stereotype, not always a negative one, but just the same, a stereotype. A few years ago, I went to a Russian space museum in Moscow. One of the displays showed some of the tools included in Russian space flights. Noticeably absent was a big-ass heavy wrench. Damn, I enjoyed this stereotype of whacking things with a big wrench to fix them. Much better. My hope is that the capsule manufacturer already includes the big heavy wrench in his capsule package. Well, I guess that this episode really showed perceived differences in logic and just how we do things. In fact, however, in these examples, Russians and Americans were not that different how they approached the logic they used to approach the situations. As a pleasant ending to this video, in 2019, on the 50th anniversary of the Fisher space pen being used by NASA, both Paul Fisher and also the Fisher Pen Company were both inducted into the Space Technology Hall of Fame. Now, Paul Fisher died in 2006 at the ripe old age of 93 years old, but his name and his memory was still being honored by this induction into the Hall of Fame. These space pens even became icons of popular culture. Even the popular 90s sitcom Seinfeld chose to feature the Fisher space pen in one episode.
What kind of pen is that?
This pen?
Yeah.
Oh, this is an astronaut pen. It writes upside down. They use this in space.
Oh, wow, that's the astronaut pen. I heard about that. Where did you get it?
I found the urban myth very believable, but now I know the real story. You know, you can buy many different models of the space pen on Amazon. Even here in Russia, you can do the same on the Russian version of Amazon, ozone.ru. Well, until my next video, пока.